Right, now that we're sharing, I'm just going to do a brief introduction and talk about some of the philosophy and architecture of what Safran Risk Manager is before I go into and do a live presentation of the tool. Okay. Somebody's actually got a microphone open. I don't know. Wouldn't you mind making sure that we're all on mute, please? I think it's Massimo. Thank you, Massimo. Appreciate that. Okay. So just a very potted history. Gustavo's already mentioned it, but I joined the military in 1989. I was in the Royal Navy as a weapons engineer, and I served 12 years in the British military, coming out in 2001 when I got a job in the aerospace industry. So I worked for BAE Systems, Celex, and then finally Leonardo. And it was during that time that I really became conscious of risk management, something I've been doing all of my career, because you can't be a nuclear submariner without being aware of risk. You can't be dealing with weapon systems without being a risk. But it was only when I started to study with the Institute of Risk Management and formally understand the frameworks within which risk management operated that I recognized that I'd been a risk manager all my life. I just didn't know I was named a risk manager. So I was very fortunate in my career within the aerospace industry. I was head of risk, and I was also head of internal audit. So not only have I worked with projects, but I've also worked at the enterprise level as well. And then I finished my career in 2018 as the Vice President of Risk in the UK. So that was my real formative introduction to risk management and the risk management environment. And I recognized that it was something which I could learn more about and grow as a professional, but also share my experiences. And it was into 2018 when I decided to set up my own limited company, the Emsity Limited Company. For anyone who's interested, Emsity is simply my initials, MCT, Mark Christopher Turner, and that's where I got the name Emsity from. And then where's my mouse not working here? Okay, so 2018, formed that limited company, and within a couple of days of forming that company, I partnered with Safran. Now, the story behind this is I've been working with Safran on and off for a couple of years at that point, and we've been testing and having some trial licenses of their Safran Risk product. But what I recognized as being a risk manager was that I'd only be using the risk analysis 2 or 3 times a year on the projects which I was working with. So each project I would use it 2 or 3 times a year to run my half-yearly or quarterly analysis of my risk register to determine if I had sufficient contingencies, if I was on schedule, if I was on cost, and those types of appropriate analysis of the software. But what I actually needed from a product was something that could help me on a day-to-day basis. How do I know that the risks are being created correctly? How do I know that the actions are being allocated to the right people with responsibility, and ensuring that those actions are being seen through and followed up on? So I approached Richard Wood and Glenn Jarrod, and I spoke to them about my ideas of what a good quality day-to-day risk management tool would look like. And then when they decided that it was a product which Safran wanted to get behind and to develop, we formed a partnership, and I've been working with them since September of 2018 to develop what now eventually became Safran Risk Manager. Now, this is a product which is sold around the world now. We've got customers in America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. And so I'm really proud of the fact that I'm now helping organizations to drive their maturity, to develop good risk management culture, and to really follow in my footsteps in understanding how risk management can add value to an organization. And as Gustavo mentioned, during my time working for myself, I also took the liberty of studying for my master's degree, which I graduated just last year. So I studied with Glasgow Caledonia University. And so not only have I had those practical years of experience, I've also now got an academic grounding upon which I can base a lot of my conversations and discussions. One of the key things which I learned through my studies was the benefit of opportunity management. And so opportunity management is something which I'm looking to introduce into the tool as we move forward along the roadmap of what Safran Risk Manager is and today and is going to develop to in the future. Okay, so talking of Safran Risk Manager, one of the I had a few key philosophical desires when I first set out to design Safran Risk Manager. The first of which was it needed to be simple. One of the troubles we had with tools like ARM or Predict, as a user of those tools, I found that they were too much for the everyday individual to use. You wouldn't expect the software engineer or the head of quality to be going into those tools on a daily basis and using them to update their risks or manage their actions. So simplicity was really a key component of what I wanted to design. And I recognize that it's still not as simple as I would like it to be. And we're actually taking some great pains to see what we can take out of the user interface to make it even simpler for the users to engage with. But hopefully I'll show to you when we go into the live demonstration just how the simplicity aspect has been formed and is a driving component through the product. The second thing is about accessibility. So not only does it need to be simple, it needs to be open and accessible to as many people within the project team as possible. At the end of the day, risk managers should not be taking responsibility for individual risks. They should be in the control of the risk of the people who have got the knowledge, the experience and the understanding to be able to manage them directly. And that means everybody should have access to the tool. So a key element of that during the design phase was how do we ensure full accessibility to as many people as possible? And that led to the architecture of the tool, which we'll talk about shortly, it being a web-based application that anybody with a browser, either on their laptop or their tablet or even on their phone, can access and be able to get the information that they need when they need it. And then the final thing, which I've already alluded to, was this empowerment, the ability to give people who are the responsible owners of risks and of actions the ability to take full control of their data. Because there's nothing worse, and I've been in this situation where you've said, this is my risk, this is my assessment of the risk, it's gone off to a risk analyst of some description, they've done some black magic around that data to make the model work, and when the model comes back it doesn't reflect the original data which I had given to them. It had been modified and changed. Now, I was very determined that we should ensure that if I take responsibility of a risk, then I got full control and ownership over the data which is associated with it. And that obviously ensures that we also have the appropriate security between projects, because I don't want people in other projects or in other divisions seeing my data, and likewise I don't want to be seeing the data from other people either. All right, so a little bit about what does Safran Risk Manager essentially cover from the risk management process. Now we focus essentially on projects. Now a project is essentially a series of objectives to be achieved. Okay, we don't have projects unless we know specifically what we're going to achieve, when we're going to achieve it, and how we're going to make that happen. So these are the objectives. So they're the firm guidelines or the markers on our route to a successful project. However, to make the project work, we need to ensure we've got teams, and teams are allocated to achieving those objectives. And then those teams are faced with the uncertainty on the delivery of those objectives. And they come from many areas. They can include the constraints, the exclusions, there may be issues, there may be changes, there's assumptions and potentially other dependencies. So these grand uncertainties all have an effect on potentially deviating from the original objectives, whether they be on cost, whether they be on time, or if they're on qualitative measures such as reputation, customer satisfaction, things like that. So this is our project environment, and all of this leads us to consider risks, namely the uncertainties associated with the delivery of our objectives, which is, if you're familiar with the literature, This is a classic definition from such things as ISO 31000. So we've got risks. Now, what do risks actually entail? They entail that there's an uncertainty associated with the delivery of our objective, and that we should be making decisions with regards to, do we do something about these risks or do we not do something about them? Can we afford to live with them, or do we need to take action? Those risks, are they with our tolerance and appetite for achieving our objectives? And so decisions need to be informed by how much money it's going to cost, how much time it's going to take, and do we have the resources available to actually make those decisions happen? So we come to that decision point, and this is where we would use a tool like Safran Risk Manager to help us prioritize, because we've only got so much money and we've only got so many resources. So we would make a decision: does the risk fall within our appetite or outside of our appetite to live with it? In which case, if it's within appetite, we would accept it. We would still have it on our risk registers. However, we would still want to maintain our monitoring of it to ensure that the external environment within which that risk operated hasn't changed, because all the time that risks are just sat there in a risk register not being monitored, things can change around and they can suddenly become more higher priority than they were when they were originally assessed. Or we decide to take action. Now, action is, in my opinion, the only point in which risk management adds any value to an organization. You can do all the analysis and all the assessment in the world that you want. If you're not taking action, then you're not actually adding any value to the organization. So a key element of Safran Risk Manager is this action focus. Are we doing what we said we're going to do, delivering it when we said we're going to deliver it? And of course, to achieve that, we need to have both a budget available, and we also need to have the resources available to ensure that that action is achieved. So either we accept the risk or we take action. Either way, we end up with a final result. And the result, hopefully, is that we've managed to avoid the risk occurring. Or if the risk has occurred, then we've managed to mitigate it such that the impact was significantly less than it could have been if we hadn't taken any action. But all of these results have a tendency to then feed back into the objectives of achieving our project and ensuring that we are ideally on budget and on time for the achievement of our objectives. So this is why good risk management is all about focusing on who can do what to achieve our objectives. And it ties nicely into, as I said, the ISO 31000 methodology. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on the achievement of objectives. Now, across this entire process also includes the concept of how are we reporting. And so Safran Risk Manager gives you a very visual view of your risks with regards to a dashboard, and also makes it easy for you to generate reports. Plus, the idea when we're considering how much money we need to cover the occurrence of risk, we would consider how much contingency we may need. Now, contingency within Safran Risk Manager is something which is a light touch. It doesn't go into too much detail. It's recommended that you also work with the Safran Risk tool to help you to determine specifically the models required to accurately determine the contingency. However, Safran Risk Manager does provide you with the capability of monitoring and tracking contingency and giving you a rough order magnitude about how much confidence you have on your exposure, which at the end of the day means you're moving in the right direction. Because one of the things which I'm very keen to stress is, as risk managers, we are never going to be correct all the time. In fact, very rarely are we ever right. But the truth is, we should be pushing our organization to do the right thing, even if we don't have the right answers. And this is how risk management can add value to an organization to ensure that we're doing the right actions at the right time with the right people, spending the right amount of money to get ultimately the objectives achieved. And then the final thing with this is we've got senior management oversight. And this is where my enterprise risk management background comes in. it's really important for senior decision makers to know that we are not only performing our risk management process correctly, but it's actually achieving the desired outcomes with regards to the delivery on our objectives. So Safran Risk Manager has been designed to try to support the organization in delivering each one of these key aspects of the risk management process. Now, with regards to the architecture that we've built this upon, Safran Risk Manager is essentially three components. There is the database, which is a SQL database. There is the user interface, which people would see on their screens, and these two talk to each other via the API, Application Programming Interface. Now, the beautiful thing about having this particular architecture is it means we can talk to other tools. That includes Safran Risk. So the data which the risk owners are putting into the database can then be extracted and used for building more comprehensive models for the analysis of cost, schedule, and joint confidence levels on cost schedule analysis. But not only do we stop at Safran Risk, we can also enable the tool to be accessed by third parties, which means we can have the ability to do, for example, Power BI or Tableau for more visualizations and reporting capabilities. So this whole architecture means that we're not just dealing with Safran Risk Manager as a single standalone component, but it becomes part of the ecosystem within which risk management forms a significant and vital component. Now, what I'd like to do is now take you into Safran Risk Manager. Okay, here we go. Try that again. Why have I lost it? Okay, there we are. All right. So, as I mentioned, Safran Risk Manager is a web-based application. So I'm now in my web browser, and I'm going to log in today as Carlos. Now, Carlos is an engineer working on a project within the data center part of an organization. So Carlos has a number of risks and a number of actions which have been allocated to him. Now, the first thing to note is that because Carlos is a user of the product and not a risk manager, he's focused and his primary interest will be on what are my risks and what are my actions. So when Carlos logs in, the first thing that he sees is the list of his open actions, his open risks. And open risks are presented by the risk name. So each row represents a risk. And should he wish to do so, he also has the ability to switch to actions and see the actions which he's been allocated. Now, the most common use case for any user would be to come in, to look at their action, take this one here, to update the status. So this was 75%. So I'm going to mark this as complete. Okay, we're going to mark it as closed. I'm going to save it. That's my action now updated to the current process, and I can log off. And it really should be as simple as turn it on, make your update, turn it off. Now, try telling that to software companies that I want to use your software tool for the minimum amount of time, and you get some funny looks. But the truth is, all the time that Carlos is making changes within a tool, he's not actually doing his actions. He's not performing the actions. So we needed to make it line one on my priority as simple as possible for him to see the data, change the data, and then turn it off again. Okay, so what I would also like to say is we need to be able to not only just see our data and update it, but we also want to review it as well. So in order to do that, Carlos has the ability to turn on individual risks. So you can see the risks will appear as tabs at the very top of the screen. And what this allows me to do is to move between the individual risk pages. So if I wish to do so, I could do copy and paste between individual risks. So it gives me the ability to see multiple risks simultaneously within the same screen, rather than jumping back and forward between a risk register. What you might have noticed is I actually open those up by selecting the little tick box. So I can clear all of my tabs instantly, and I can select them by the tick, or if I select its name, it opens that tab. Now the one I'm interested in is number XX. So if I open XX, now I'm going to give a brief overview of what the risk data is that we hold within Safran Risk Manager. But before I do that, I just want to say that we try to follow a very simple structure of: have we identified what the risk is? Have we assessed how impactful that risk is and how likely it is to occur? And then have we done some analysis to better understand what is the outcome should the risk event occur? Now, we also have the ability to record information with regard to the occurrence of those risks. So, for example, risks which aren't just a once only occurrence, but may occur several times throughout the life cycle of the project. So, for example, fraud or the theft of equipment don't just stop being a risk just because they've happened once. They can happen again and again. So we have the ability to record incidents as well. So we've got a record of any occurrences of the risk. So under the risk identification, this is essentially the metadata associated with the identification of the risk. And it contains information about what the risk is, who's going to take responsibility for it. And you can see here Carlos has been identified as the owner. When is it likely to happen between the start date and the end date? And we've got the ability to record notes associated with it. And these notes can be hyperlinked out to a SharePoint, for example, which can contain the evidence to support the assessment of the risk. And you'll also notice that we specifically identify whether it's a threat or an opportunity. Now, in the current version of Safran Risk Manager, opportunities are essentially the inverse of a threat. They've got likelihood and they've got impact. However, based on my research, we're going to be moving forward with alternative views as to what opportunities can be in the future, which includes the likelihood of occurrence and the likelihood of success, and also the impact should the opportunity occur, or if the opportunity fails, what is the opposite impact. So we have quite a new approach to how opportunities could, if we wish to use them, differ from threats in our current environment. But it's something on our roadmap, so something which I'm very excited to be talking about in a future presentation. Okay, we've got the ability to say, how does this risk affect other risks within my register? This is the relationships. We have the ability to categorize it against things like the risk breakdown structure, the categories. I mentioned at the beginning that we have objectives on the project, and those objectives will have deliverables, so we can tie the individual risks to the higher level objectives. We also understand that the projects move through their life cycle phases. So risks which are clustered at the beginning of a project, the life cycle phase of maybe design, they should be different from the risks which occur at the later stages of the project, such as the implementation or the support phase. And we can differentiate between risks which happen early and risks which happen late within the project, so that we have the best view of how to treat those risks as we move through that life cycle. We also have the ability to create custom fields. So we recognize that even though we've got some really good coverage of almost all the key elements that most organizations would recognize as being required for a risk register, we do recognize that some organizations have got bespoke requirements. So the ability to be able to create your own text fields, date fields, integer number fields is available to you. We also want to say, what is our strategy for treating this risk, to either prevent its occurrence or to mitigate it should it occur. So we can have an overarching conversation about the strategy which we're going to take, but these aren't the same as the individual actions which will be allocated to the owners and the users once we understand the causes and impacts of the risk, which I'll talk about very shortly. And then finally, the last thing which and a recent addition to the tool is this idea of how effective are we controlling the risk? with regard to its long-term controls. As I mentioned, some risks are persistent. They never stop potentially impacting a project, like the theft of material. So we should be looking to introduce not only the actions which can prevent that from occurring, but the controls which are constant and ongoing to monitor, to detect those types of risks occurring. And so we can use control effectiveness to not only say how impactful is our risk, but also how well controlled the risk is as well. Okay, now I've mentioned causes and impacts a number of times. The key element to Safran Risk Manager is that we view the risk as a bow tie. Now, the bow tie, for those not familiar with it, says that a risk event is driven by the occurrence of one or more causes, which we also call sources, so the source of the risk. And should they occur, then they would have one or more impacts. And the impacts are in different domains. So the domain could be cost, it could be time, or it could be a qualitative assessment such as customer satisfaction or reputation or some other measure which is difficult to quantify either in cost or time. So we have the ability to build up a comprehensive view of the things which drive the risk and the things which occur will impact should the risk event occur. And this is really fundamental in the idea of where do we take the most appropriate action, because actions can be of two flavors. They can either prevent the risk event occurring, in which case they are specifically targeted at the source, or they can protect in the event of the risk occurring. So we would essentially visualize this on the left hand side and saying these are protective actions, or on the right hand side to say that these are I'll say that again. The ones on the left are preventative actions, and then the ones on the right are protective actions. Whilst talking about threats, we should never forget that risk incorporates opportunities. So if this was an opportunity risk, you would be looking at what can we do to enhance and benefit or drive up the likelihood of an opportunity occurring, and what can we do to maximize its impact as and when the opportunity does occur. So this simple visualization of the risk enables us to have complete access over the data. So if I wish to open this particular source, I can select it. And we also work both qualitatively and quantitatively with the data. So if I wish to only make an assessment from a qualitative perspective and say, this is a likely risk that's going to happen before I take some action, and if I take some action, then it's going to be unlikely that it's going to occur, well, I can simply use these slider bars to make that assessment for it. What you'll notice is between the pre-action and the post-action actually exists the action that I'm going to take, because these things don't magically occur. You can't move from a pre-position to a post-position without being specific about the action you're going to take. And indeed, the tool does a data validation to ensure that an action has been identified so that you can move between a pre and a post position. So this is our likelihood. In a very similar way, we can look at our impact. Now, the difference between the impact is impacts have a distribution associated with their occurrence. There's several distribution types which are commonly used, but we've decided that the triangle is the default version, the view that we're going to have. So in the same way that we've qualitatively assessed the likelihood, we can also qualitatively assess the impact simply by using the slider bar. But the slider bar gives us just the midpoint of a triangularly distributed impact. And in order to get the distribution range between a tight triangle and a broadly dispersed triangle, we have a second slider which simply asks the question, how confident am I in my assessment of this impact? So if I've got low confidence, it gives me a broad triangle, and you can see that from the values here. So I've got a 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 impact. However, if I have high confidence, then I just take off 5%. So in this case, 47.5, 50, 52.5. If I put that up to 100,000, you can see even clearer, 5% plus or minus. So it's really simple to get a 3-point distribution from these two simple slider bars. However, we do recognize that for both the likelihood and the impact, you might want to be very specific in the quantified value that you wish to use. So it's possible for you to switch off the qualitative, and now you have full access to make changes to the values within the distribution, and even change the distribution so that it's more appropriate to the risk impact you're likely to find. So for example, I might decide I want to put in a beta PERT, and I can quickly just populate the beta PERT there, and now I've also got the ability to make changes to it. Once again, pre-treatment, what are the actions I'm going to take, and then my post-treatment assessment. Now, if I wish to do so, let me just get some data in here which will match-ish. Okay, I can also quickly see what that plot looks like. So I've got a triangular distribution post-treatment and a beta PERT distribution pre-treatment. I've also got the ability to record the basis of estimate. What is it that helped me to decide on the impacts that this was going to take? And once again, these can be hyperlinked out to a SharePoint document or another third-party repository for you to link to as evidence supporting. Okay, so we've looked at the assessment. If we want to do so, we can also see that information summarized, so we can see what our total scores are. By changing the likelihoods and changing the impacts, we also change the score against which the risk has been evaluated. We can also see what the individual actions are. We also can see what our controls are too. And then once we've done that assessment, one of the things we might want to look at is what is our analysis overall. So this essentially reproduces the total impact of the risk. So I've shown you just before a plot of the data. This is one individual impact. So this is the single cost impact. But one thing you'll notice on here, I have two cost impacts. I've got a labor impact and I've got a material impact. Now, how do we add those two together? Well, the simple way is to simulate it. So we run a Monte Carlo simulation to give us the aggregate of those two cost impacts to determine what the total cost impact is of that particular risk. And you can see here that the values here are different from what I showed you on the individual risk. And I can do that for both cost and I can do it for time as well. So I can determine my pre-treatment and my post-treatment impacts, cost and time. And I also have a small table here which gives me my minimum, mean, maximum and median values for those. I mentioned before, we've got the ability to record records of risks occurring or the incidents of occurring, and we can actually generate a report on that. Plus, we also have the ability to record the audit trail as to who made what changes to the risk when, so that it's possible to actually understand if I'm making changes, what's happened and when those changes were made. So we've got that auditable trail to follow through. So there's a lot of information, but it means that Carlos has at his fingertips, as reference to my point 3, the full control over the data, which are going to be subsequently used for measuring and monitoring his performance, but also for outputting into other tools like Safran Risk, such that the data becomes the single source of truth. Now, one of the questions which I'm always asked is, okay, so that's great to complete a pre-populated risk, one that I filled in before, but how easy is it to create a new risk in the register? So if Carlos has identified a new risk and wishes to enter it, what he needs to do is first of all identify the specific project against which this risk will be added. So Carlos has been assigned to 2 projects, okay, and I'm going to add a risk to the Mexico City data center. So I simply select the name of the register, and this is now the details of the risk register, and I can now review that to ensure, first of all, that the risk I've identified has not already been captured by somebody else. And if I'm happy that this is a new risk to add to the register, then I simply select Add New or New Risk. And from here, I've got two choices. My first choice is I can use the library of existing risks, which has been curated by administration, to add a new risk. So I've got here the global risk library, and from this I can add an existing risk. So I can add that, and it then pre-populates all the information that I would need to add a new material cost increase risk to my project, with the exception of the likelihood of occurrence and the impact should it occur. Because quite simply, it's almost impossible for a library to understand the context within which individual projects exist. So it's necessary for us to specifically identify the likelihood and impact for each individual risk within the context of its own project. But it's easy enough to do. I know that it's an economic change and I think that's going to be unlikely, and I can hit add, and that's now been added, and I can say it's a cost, and I'm going to say that's a material cost, and that's a high impact, and I add that. But this only gives me one source and one impact. And as we mentioned during that bow tie discussion, we can have multiple sources or multiple impacts should they occur. And so we could quite simply add more. So if I wanted to add another source, and I'm going to select that as high likely, then I can add that. So I'm now building up the left-hand side of my bow tie. And if I decided that my time was an impact, then I could type in maybe schedule delay. And my tag would be a time impact, which would be completion, increase in duration, which would be moderate impact. And then, for example, let's say there's going to be a health and safety impact associated with this. Let's say injury, and that is a health and safety. So I can add health and safety. And once again, I can select that's a high impact and high. So in the space of a minute or so, what I've been able to do is to create all the necessary basic information for that risk to be created. And when I hit save now, what it's done, it opens in the same view that I just previously showed to you with those key pieces of information which we recorded. And I can now go back to my new risk and I can add another and another. And if I'm in a workshop, then I'll be quite happy to be able to populate this as people are giving me the information. When I'm back at my desk and I've got the time to consider it, I can then go back into my risk and I can make some key decisions about it. When's it likely to occur? How's it going to be categorized? What are the key assessments with regards to the likelihood and the impact? Have we made a good judgment on our first pass, or do we need to be understanding more what the pre-treatment likelihood is? And then, of course, the true added value, what actions are we going to take now that we have identified that risk? And it's during that action identification stage that we want to assess the post-treatment position to better understand the benefits derived from the actions which we're taking. So that is the key details that Carlos has got to put data into the tool. But I also mentioned that we wanted to be able to visualize this data. So to have a dashboard and have outputs is something which Carlos also has access to, because it's his data, so he should be able to see what's effect he's having on his project. Now, the key data associated with the project includes how many risks we have and what life cycle state they're in. Are they approved or unapproved, or are they closed? Where do my risks sit on a probability impact matrix? And quite unique for Safran Risk Manager is the ability for us to drill down into that matrix to see how impactful different types of impact can be. So, for example, we're looking at our cost impact, or if I wish to do so, I could look at my qualitative impacts, and I can drill down one level further to say, let's see where's that health and safety impact that I identified, and it's represented by the icons on the matrix. Now, if I wish to see the specific detail about that risk, I can select it. And what it does, it opens the tab at the top of the dashboard. So I'm still in my dashboard, but I can open that and I can now see in exactly the same format that we had previously, the identification, the assessment, and the analysis of that particular risk that we're looking at without moving away from the dashboard. I mentioned about the value of actions. Well, one of the models we have here is a cost benefit model. It simply asks the question, how much benefit do we get from the action that we're going to take? between the pre-treatment position and the post-treatment position, and that's demonstrated from an individual risk basis by the chart on the left and in total on the chart on the right, giving us the information as to how much the project benefits from the actions we're going to take. We also have the ability to categorize the data as mentioned during the individual categorization, but we can now see that laid out. So who has the most risks on my project? I can look at that by function, I can look at it by the individual owner, and I can see here that Carlos has got 5 risks allocated to him. And I can also break it down via the risk breakdown structure. Now, the risk breakdown structure is common across all the projects. So if I'm the risk director, then I can look across my portfolio and I can determine which area of my organization is carrying the most risk. And then finally, the impacts, which we've talked about before, cost, time, and qualitative. We can see that in the chart, giving you a breakdown of the ratios between the top levels or the sub tags. So in this particular instance, I'm looking at my cost and I can see that the majority of my risk is held by labor, some of it is material, and I've got a little bit of expenses. Now, what I would say about this is each of these categories is entirely customizable by you as an organization, so it can fit your methodology and your process. So that's the end of the demonstration for what Carlos has the ability to do. And I know that Gustavo has requested that I do a follow-on presentation, which will be taking place next month, where I will be talking about what the risk manager themselves is able to see with respect to ownership of the risks, and also for the assurance of the quality of the data which is going into it, and ensuring that we have workflows and those types of things which give us good assurance that the data which we're going to be modelling in our tools like Safran Risk have been appropriately reviewed and vetted to ensure that they're accurate. But Gustavo, that's my 45 minutes that you gave me. Hopefully that is good enough. Well, I just
this was so complete. This was so complete. Thank you so much, Mark. We have one question from Colin. He said, "How secure is the website? Can access be restricted for commercially sensitive or security, like defense information?" Please go.
Very good. Very good question. So we've got 2 flavors of deployment. The first is our Azure hosted cloud. So that comes with all the Microsoft assurances. But for those companies, and we do have customers who are in both the national infrastructure and also security and national defense, they have opted to have it hosted on-premise, so they can have an on-premise installation, and that works within their own environment, and they can safeguard it within their DMZs and such. So yeah, we do have full security from an external penetration, and then from an internal, we have the firewalls which establish you can only see what you need to see on the projects that you've been allocated to. So the simple rule is, if you've not been allocated to a project, you don't even get to see the name of the project. It's not visible to you. You can only see the data once you've been allocated to the project.